presence of God to you this morning.
I see.
What do you think about that?
Okay.
Really?
So am I.
Why not?
So am I.
What a different reaction than I got from the earlier service. When you think about somebody making a statement like that, what's your kind of reaction? Because sometimes it helps us understand this reading today where Jesus is making great claims about being the bread of life, and they're saying, we know your father and your mother. We know where you came from. You know, you're kind of getting too big for your britches here. And that is their response. They want to keep heaven in heaven, and they want to have earth remain earth. Don't try to mix them up. Don't try to get too lofty in your thinking and how you're looking at this. They said the Jews began to complain about him because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. They were saying, is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, I have come down from heaven? So there is this complaining that's going on, and I want to unpack this a little bit. Isn't it true that we're hard on people? And we're probably hard on people because we're hard on ourselves. Right? I think those go together. I would have preferred that Paul add something a little extra to the epistle that was just read, which was, be kind to other people. There should have been a bit in there about, be kind to yourself.
Yeah.
Because those are connected. And when we're pretty rigid and intense about our critique of other people and saying, oh, you think you know it all? You think you have these solutions, do you? Well, we know where you came from. We know the whole story. There is a resistance in this complaining, though, that reveals something, which is to say, it's hard for us to accept the reality of God's presence in our very real lives. God is up there, whatever that means, and we are here. We love the idea of the incarnation. We love the idea. But when we think about it, it's too close for comfort. God right here, God in our lives, and sometimes it limits our ability to receive what's around us because we know too much, right? We know our frailties, we know our tendencies to act a certain way, be a certain way, we know our weaknesses, and therefore we think somehow God can't be part of it. So we dissociate heaven and earth. We fail to receive the full presence of God in our lives. So today, I want you to do one thing. Lighten up on yourself. Do you think you can do that?
I don't know.
Lighten up on yourself so that you'll lighten up on me. No. Or lighten up on everybody else. Because we're uncomfortable with our humanity. And that's a challenge. But when you think about these characters today that are missing out on the presence of God because of the way they see a human, Jesus, they're saying there's no connection between heaven and earth. That's a pretty bad place to start with your faith. And think about, if you will, the people that you really, really love. Are they perfect? What's your real reaction to somebody you see as always the perfect person?
I don't hang out with them.
You don't hang out with them. It's the straight A student, right? Or the person that you just say, they always get it right. we are, if we're honest, endeared to people that have frailties, that have, they're characters, right? We love them for it, even if we're irritated at times. But we understand deep inside the connection between heaven and earth, between love and reality and humanity. We can feel it. It's not that far to go to understand that God is like that because we are made in God's image. So there's a phrase that has always stayed in my mind. It comes from a psychoanalyst, D.W. Winnicott, who wrote a book called Playing and Reality. He's a British pediatrician. And he referred, this is the phrase, to the good enough mother. The good enough mother. Now, what he was talking about is that, when you have a new child, there's a sense of perfection that comes upon you. I'm going to tend to every possible need. I'm going to be there for you around the clock, respond to you. I don't want you to ever cry. I want to meet all of your needs, which is an important first step in the growth process. It's not to say that that is not important, but ultimately, if you let that go on too long, I think there's another phrase. What is it, Keller? The helicopter parents, that just can't let go. It can become a negative part of the natural journey of a child, where they need you as a parent to underperform a little bit. Anybody ever underperform as a parent? It's not a bad thing, because it helps the child to then face reality. You're not going to find this out here in the world, and you're not going to get it from me all the time either, quite frankly. And so there's this growth that comes out of it. But I was thinking about just being good enough. I love that phrase. You're good enough, right? It's some honesty to it, has some humility to it, has some self-acceptance to it. It's a good phrase. Now, the reason why I wandered away from my conservative Baptist roots is because it was exhausting to be perfect all the time. And that's what this particular church sort of demanded of me. No doubts, no questions, always a smile on your face, always filled with the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Life couldn't be better. And then I wandered into the Episcopal Church. And you know what? The Episcopal Church is good enough. It's a good enough kind of a church. It welcomed all the seasons of my life, because it has seasons. It wasn't always a bright summer day in the Episcopal Church. You have Lent. You have doubts. You have questions. You embrace suffering. You have adventure, you have epiphanies, you journey through times where you're pushing the limits of your theological exploration. You have Easter, the challenge to believe in the impossible and to think outside the box. You have Pentecost, the awareness that God can actually be in you. And this is something you can express and bring to the world. It had all of these contours in it that meant something to me. It said, you're good enough. And welcome to a good enough church. I think that's a wonderful thing. I think we're a good enough church. Now, a lot of our perfectionism has been ingrained in us, probably in our family story. All of that. You better do it right. You better get it right all the time. And if you don't get it right, you should feel bad about yourself. But I think some of it also comes from theology. And so allow me one of my little preoccupations, which is a philosophical moment, to talk a little bit about Aristotle. Aristotle, when he was trying to come up with a concept of God, decided to refer to God as the unmoved mover. The reason why God had to be unmovable was because any indication of imperfection wouldn't fit the concept of God, that God is perfect. God is without flaw. That means God can't learn. Because if God learned something, that would mean God didn't know it in the first place, which we considered an imperfection. If God changed it all, it meant that God had to go from point A to point B. That meant point A was inadequate to point B, and therefore God is imperfect. So God had to be unmovable. And yet, he had to explain, how can the world seem like it's always moving and changing, and how can God relate to that? So God became this sort of distant, unapproachable reality that caused the movement in the world, but was dissociated from it. And therefore, our perception of free will is ridiculous, because God has already seen everything in one glimpse. So predeterminism. God already has seen everything, and it's going to be exactly like that, because God doesn't get anything wrong. Right? And thus came the whole theological flow throughout history from that concept, that God cannot change, does not evolve, does not adjust. Of course, if you read a fair number of biblical stories, you'll say that's contradictory to those stories, where God changes God's mind often. So this has gone on, and it's what has created this fault line between heaven and earth. It's just another example of how we limit our ability to understand God's present incarnationally in our very real crazy lives, right? Like in a pandemic. God is right here. God is present with us in your life, in your imperfections. You're good enough. You're good enough. I like the idea. I like it being a good enough father, a good enough mother, a good enough friend, a good enough sister, good enough brother, good enough wife, good enough husband, good enough rector. That's what the personnel committee should do. They should say, you're good enough. You're good enough, Scott.
We're on it.
Yeah. You know, that's all we have to say about you.
Don't hold
You're
your breath.
Just good enough. So Jesus, was drawn into all this, and so people have never really known how to deal with Jesus other than to give him a virgin mother. And then he never made a mistake in his life. And keeping that imperfection away from Jesus as much as possible. But here Jesus is inviting it. He's inviting the connection between heaven and earth. And I was fortunate enough when theology actually started to change, which started with a guy named Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote the Process and Reality. There's a book to read. All about metaphysics. Things like actual entities and how they collide with other things. And it's hard to read book. Out of that came a concept that we live in a universe that is constantly changing. And we can still understand it. We can still find truth in it. A guy named Charles Hartshorne then applied that to theology. And at one point, he was considered one of the two most prominent living philosophers in the world. And I got to be his student because he came to Colorado College when I was undergraduate there. And he didn't come there because I was there. And he didn't really come there for the college either. He came there because he wanted to do bird watching in the Rocky Mountains. He said, well, gee, I might as well get paid while I'm doing the bird watching. So there were 5 of us in this class, which meant I got to go on walks with this guy. And I look back on that in my life as an amazing gift to me. We used to debate everything. But what he taught me was, the passion for understanding God as really incarnate, really involved, really listening to us, really responding to us, really engaged in our life, in our very human lives. And it's just such a compassionate view that gave life a process, that drew God into that process in a very beautiful and compassionate way. And it was just, it really changed my life. Jesus was trying to open the doorway between heaven and earth. He wanted to call us, good enough Christians, good enough humans, good enough people. Perhaps no one has modeled this more courageously today than Simone Biles. Right? You look at the reactions. Examine your own reaction. Right? If you're honest, like, oh, win the gold. You want to take your own kind of story or wish and impose it on somebody else, or live into someone else's life. That's where we get into trouble, trying to live through somebody else. And yet, here's somebody that's won 3 consecutive world championships, 25 medals, more than any other gymnast, way more. She won 4 out of 5 gold medals in the world championships. And then she arrives at the Olympics, and she listens to herself. She becomes human. And she only won 2 medals, and dare I say, a bronze medal just might be good enough. It just might be good enough. And what a model that she has been to what matters, and how transparent she's been to her journey and her struggle through a very difficult time in her life. We are so hard on others because we are hard on ourselves. Let Jesus be incarnate in your life. Let heaven and earth connect at the intersection of your imperfect humanity. Let yourself be human. Enjoy being good enough.